All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and good morning to those calling in from across Oceania. Thanks for attending today's webinar. We're very excited for today's presentation, which is going to cover Transpower's scenario-based approach to planning for New Zealand's energy future. My name is Jessica McDonald, and I'm a manager with the Edison Electric Institute in the International Programs Department, and I will be the host for today's webinar. Before we get started, I'm just going to quickly cover some housekeeping items for the webinar before turning it over to our moderator, Lawrence Jones, who is Vice President for International Programs, and he will introduce our esteemed speakers for today. So on the housekeeping items, I just wanted to make everyone aware that throughout the presentation today, you may submit questions using the chat feature that's located on the right-hand side of your screen. We will have time at the end for a moderated Q&A. I also wanted to make everyone aware that this webinar is being recorded, and a recording will be made available on our International Programs YouTube channel within about a week of today's presentation. I also wanted to make everyone aware that we do have another upcoming webinar that is going to be within your time zone. It is going to feature speakers from China Electric Power Research Institute. It will take place on Thursday, June 13th at 8 a.m., and it will focus on the title there, Lessons from Control Technology Pilots for Integrating High Penetrations of DERs. And lastly, if you're interested in learning more about EEI's International Programs Department, we want to encourage you to subscribe to our monthly newsletter, and you can stay up to date with our upcoming activities and other webinars that we have further down the road. So you can do that by emailing us at international@eei.org. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Lawrence Jones. As I said, he's the Vice President for International Programs, and he is the moderator for today. So hi, Lawrence.
Thank you, Jess, and good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone across the globe who have joined in, both from Oceania and other parts of the world. We're delighted to be having this webinar today. As you all know, the issue of planning our energy future is one that is front and center across the globe, and obviously different countries and different grid operators are taking different approaches. But I think what is key to all of the different approaches is that we can learn from the different approaches and see how we can, in some cases, adapt what has been done in other parts of the world, in some cases learn what not to do in other parts of the world based on the experience we're getting from just different sources in terms of how the grids are being prepared and how the grids are being developed. This week, I was in a couple of discussions where the focus was really on the role of the integrated grid, looking at the role of transmission as well as looking at the role of distribution and how it all fits together. And I think as we look at our industry going through this transformation, no part of the industry is more critical to this than the system operators, who have a significant role in not just making sure that the overall system and markets operate, but to also anticipate how to go about planning for that future, which has a series of uncertainties which they have to grapple with. And so this morning, we're very glad to have as our presenters the CEO of Transpower, Alison, as well as the Senior Strategy Advisor at Transpower, Kit Redgewell. A little bit about the background. So Alison joined Transpower in 2014. She's held numerous senior positions within the company, but also within the industry in New Zealand. Most recently, she was the global head of chemicals for Orica PLC. She's currently the director of Ports of Tauranga and has a director role within Genesis Energy as well. In her prior role, she's served as executive within Frontera Corporate Group, as well as part of the Flesh Challenger Group in energy, forest, and paper. She has an MBA from Warwick University, and also the degree in engineering from the Auckland University. Kit Redgewell is a senior strategy advisor, as I said, at Transpower. She joined the company in 2014. She's also held a number of senior roles across Transpower, including recently as a chief executive advisor and strategic asset manager. Prior to that, she was associate with Bell Gully, one of New Zealand's leading commercial firms. And she's also been specializing in the issues related to climate change. She studied at the University of Otago. And so before I just turn it over to Alison and Kate, I just want to say that during the course of the webinar, if you have questions, you can send them in. We're going to try and field those questions towards the end. And with that, Alison and Kate, please, over to you.
Kia ora koutou, and thank you very much for having Kate and I here. Today we're going to talk about the recent work we've been doing considering the future of energy in New Zealand and how we think that electricity may help decarbonise the New Zealand economy and the steps we're taking in scenario planning to help us plan for that future. But before we get into that discussion, I thought it might be just useful to talk a little bit about Transpower, the New Zealand power system, and some of our unique geography and regulatory challenges and opportunities. So we are in New Zealand, have one national grid, one transmission system, so we're the national grid owner, and we also have the role of being the independent system operator, so we do those two roles, which I think is reasonably unique. And we have a long, skinny country with quite a lot of geographic features, and our transmission network runs from deep in the south to the top of the North Island, 12,000 kilometres. We have an HVDC link across Cook Strait running up part of the South Island. And our system features are we're highly renewable generation, over about 83% renewable. And some of the challenges are we're quite isolated from the rest of the world. Our closest neighbour, Australia, is realistically too far away to connect via any kind of connection system. So we're on our own, really, as far as our power system goes. And the challenges we have to run a national grid that's safe, reliable and secure, cost-effective and adaptive and flexible, I'm sure those challenges are ones that everyone is grappling with around the world. So just briefly, next slide, so about 12,000 k's of high voltage lines, nearly 50,000 structures, 174 substations. So small by international grids and standards, but self-contained and our own challenges. Where we fit in, just very briefly, a very important part of the integrated value chain. So generators connect to our transmission system, and the grid runs off to some direct connect industrial customers and all the distribution networks in New Zealand, of which there are 29, who then they provide the connection to end customers, and there are retailers who play in that mix as well. So a very important integrated value chain. Now I want to talk to you about Te Mauri Hiko and why did we do this piece of work? One of the unique opportunities you have as a transmission company is that you can afford to take a long-term view. You'll all know that we have to plan our systems. They take a long time to build, they cost a lot of money, and you plan to have them there for the foreseeable future. So there's a real obligation to make sure that the grids we build, the systems we operate, are enduring and are the right things. And that double jeopardy of either you build too early, costs are too high and people whinge, or you don't build in time and the power's not there and you're fired. So that challenge about how do we make sure we have the right grid in the right place for what's coming. And what we saw was there's a lot of big change out there. You'll all be facing the same things. First of all, huge amount of technology change coming at us, solar, wind, batteries. Batteries are a real game changer, being able to store power once it's been generated. So much happening in that space, but also a real awareness growing globally around climate change and the hydrocarbon problem, and how do we decarbonise our economies and the role that renewables will play in this. So we saw a real opportunity and a challenge and said, how do we actually think about what is an extremely uncertain future? Probably we saw that with all this new technology coming, we were going to be seeing exponential growth as opposed to just linear growth that was somehow we're all programmed to think about. So we thought we really had to have a good look at, first of all, kind of the global space, then the New Zealand energy space, and then what that might mean for electricity. Hence, we got in some consultants to help us strategically think about what types of different futures, what kind of scenarios, and then how might we think about planning towards that. So I think our views changed from just 3 years ago. when I first came into the Transpower role, we had probably for the first 5 years of my time here, no new generation built. If anything, we had some grid expansions, so that created the opportunity for retirement of some thermal plant off our system. And people were forecasting a decline in power, electricity demand, and things were not looking that exciting from a forward perspective. What we're now seeing is that a huge opportunity to decarbonise the economy by replacing transport fuels in the first instance and industrial process heat with electricity, and help New Zealand meet its commitments under the Paris Accord towards decarbonising our economy by 2050. And I just should talk about, very careful to caveat in the beginning, we've chosen a range of scenarios both on the demand and supply side. We've had to pick a demand scenario and a supply scenario because to plan a grid you need to have a base case assumption. But it's clear to say whatever we choose we will be wrong, because anyone who thinks they can predict what's going to happen in 2050, that's not going to pan out. So the key place about our scenarios is to have enough bandwidth between the high and lows and different scenarios that we think we've reasonably captured the likely probable outcomes. And I think what's been really interesting is Te Mauri Hiko, the Energy Futures paper, has given a lot. The whole intention was to create a dialogue, to get people lifted out of the day-to-day fighting over the size of the pie, thinking about what could be in the future, the opportunity for New Zealand, the role that electricity can play in that, and how might we work towards with our politicians, our regulators, our key stakeholders, the people of New Zealand, to realise what could be a very exciting and positive future, and genuinely making a difference to decarbonise and make our commitment to climate change. So that was the process we talk about. Kate was involved directly as a project team member, so she can answer specifics about how we went about it. We did engage some external support, and they did a good job to help strategically us through our thinking. So just to talk about how we went about it, we, as I say, looked very much at the external, the world, the big drivers happening internationally. Then we looked at how that might transpire into New Zealand and in electricity, and built a really robust views, if you like, of what demand could do in New Zealand. Some of the big drivers there were, this is quite a busy slide that you can read, but what we really thought about is, the big drivers that are going to make a difference is, first of all, can the world avoid disruptive climate change? A big driver, too, of where demand goes is, will the world stay integrated? Or will we get these trade barriers, people shutting down, and no sharing of technology? This is important too in terms of how fast will technology develop, and will it be ubiquitous and shared around the world? That comes into that second piece around technology, or the third piece, I beg your pardon, around technology adopted. So we picked 4 different scenarios which really captured the breadth of possibilities we felt. We did have one scenario around the world blows up because climate change can't be avoided, but that's not a very interesting scenario that leads you anywhere. So exciting for 2 minutes, but then we took it off our radar. But you'll see there that New Zealand Inc. is our base case. It's a reasonably positive view for how we saw demand. And we have some other scenarios around, well, under a vibrant haven, does New Zealand become a place where enormous climate migrants come to, versus struggling alone, where the world basically turns on itself and we all go backwards from an economic growth perspective. So that's the range of demand scenarios. Then we looked at a number of, likewise, supply scenarios. And you'll see there our base case was the Clean New Zealand. And the key drivers there is how much penetration are we going to get of distributed solar? Is the country going to allow gas peakers? And what is going to be the main source of new utility generation? The reason these are important is that, first of all, you'll all be aware of distributed solar. It depends a lot on your geographic conditions. Countries like Australia have enormous potential for solar. The sun is just hotter, there's more deserts, it shines. New Zealand, land of a long white cloud. We have some places where it's nice and sunny, we have a lot of wind, and we have a lot of places where it's cold. So there's different types of solar potential across the country. On the peakers, the government has taken quite a strong stance that they want gas out of our system. A lot of places around the world, gas is being used very importantly as a transition fuel, and it makes quite a big difference to our scenarios where the peakers are permitted or retired. And then what's the main source of new generation? New Zealand has a lot of wind resource. Obviously, they're going to be permitting and consenting conditions about whether the NIMBYs are going to allow lots of wind being built. And you'll see there, we've had 4 scenarios. We added a 5th more recently because we are continuing to evolve our work, and we're concerned that actually the amount of penetration of solar in networks is lower than we had anticipated. If that's the case and demand still takes off, where is the new source of generation going to come from? And we've given a roaring 40s where there's a lot more wind generation. So those are our demand scenarios. So just in terms of supply scenarios, I beg your pardon. So I've said we had to pick a base case for our planning purposes, although we run the sensitivities, and that's where we've got to the New Zealand Inc. and the Clean New Zealand, which is a reasonably optimistic and exciting view for what the future of New Zealand, we believe, is likely to be. We've had a lot of feedback on our scenarios, and I think it's fair to say that there's been a migration over time from this is ridiculous to, hey, this makes sense, but you're too ambitious. I think most of the debate now is not, this is not going to happen, it's a question of timing. And I think it's important to point out that the scenario we've built would get us to where we can meet Paris commitments and we can decarbonise our economy by 2050. If there is any delay to how fast our scenario takes off and what happens, it will push out either that date past 2050 or it will make the journey to 2050 that much more aggressive and difficult to drive. So that's probably the key sensitivity. I thought it'd be useful just to show you very briefly a slide here which talks about how we went about estimating demands, quite detailed, granular build-up. We looked at the different type of sectors, applied the 80-20 rule, focused on the big demand bricks, really tried to understand the drivers behind those mix bricks, for instance. What type of users are there, what type of energy do they have now, what are the efficiency gains that might come into the future. We looked at trying to estimate drivers. It's always challenging, I think, in our thinking to really think about the possibilities of new technology and change. We all tend to be anchored in today, and it's quite hard to challenge yourself to think about realistically where technology might step change to. I think it's dangerous to think technology is going to save us all and the planet's going to be decarbonised through solely new technology. We just have to sit back and wait for it to be uncovered. But by the same token, I think we've got to be careful we don't underestimate the impact of new technology, the costings and the possibilities. So that's kind of always a challenge in this type of analysis. And then we decomposed it right down into regional breakdowns because we have a long, skinny country, quite different geographical conditions from the cold south to the tropical north. Looked at different daily, interseasonal, yearly demand, which is quite important when you're running a hydro system, which is largely run-of-river, and then the different types of sectors. So there's a reasonable amount of detail that's gone behind in building up our demand scenarios. Moving on, here's a slide which shows on the left-hand side in 2016 what the total demand for energy across New Zealand is, and then how we're forecasting it to be in our base scenario in 2050. And you'll see a lot more electrification. So this is where we're seeing that by decarbonising transport fuel and low industrial process heat, we can get a lot of the hydrocarbons out of our energy mix. And what's interesting, if you see overall our total energy demand is dropping, even though demand is increasing overall, the efficiency of electricity actually drives an overall lower terawatt hours demand in 2050. So I think we're really seeing a net reduction in total energy, but a big drive to increasing electrification, and we're seeing our electricity demand on our system doubling by 2050. Some of that will come from distributed generation. We're assuming quite large reductions in overall demand will still come from energy efficiency, and then a lot still is going to be grid connected. So if you look at the shape of the industry, just mapping out again from where we are today until 2050, you can see there's a lot more renewables of much greater scale coming into our system. The challenge here is we have some unique challenges in running our power system. I'm sure, like lots of other countries, how do we actually meet energy overall, and that's the daily and interseasonal. We still predict with climate change, New Zealand is going to have a evening winter peak load demand. Electricity is used a lot for heating domestically. That drives the peak, so we have to have enough energy around to meet that, and capacity. So this is just showing how we see the evening peak building up. We have seen a strong correlation between electric vehicles and solar and batteries, and if we can use the batteries behind the distribution system to help us manage peaks, to help shave off those demands, that would be extremely helpful from an avoided cost of distribution and transmission. So we do think that tagging domestic solar with a battery is so much more useful from a network owner's perspective, and just making sure that we can take advantage of getting full value out of batteries behind the grid, we think is really, really important. This is just showing you how we still see the evening peak requirement growing as population grows. Not as fast as that, because if you bring on more loads, such as the dairy plants who are using thermal heat for drying, replace that with electricity, they have a different coincident peak, which could be helpful. But unfortunately, we can't. One of the challenges we have in New Zealand is with our hydro system, as I say, we don't have a lot of storage. We've only got about 4 weeks of storage, but we're hugely dominated by hydro. So we do rely on deep storage from thermal fuels to actually meet our requirements. This slide here shows the, if we don't have peaker support, so we don't have thermal to firm up our hydro, you can see some of the challenges we meet in terms of how we're actually going to meet that peak demand. We think the daily peaks and perhaps some of the day-night peaks we can manage with the renewables on the system. The challenge will be when we have a dry winter and not enough water in our storage lakes, and how we're actually going to meet the peak winter demand when there's not that deep storage. Just to give you some examples, this last year we had 2 droughts and 2 floods. So our hydro lakes have gone from being extraordinarily low, quite concerned about how we're going to meet the upcoming winter peak demand towards the end of last year. Our big coal plant has had 3 250 megawatt coal plants. 2 of those were running pretty flat out. And the generator imported a lot of coal, and now we have hydro lakes over 180% full. So you just have these extraordinarily dramatic events, which are quite hard to predict, and means that the thermal has had quite an important load in our system. We think the peaks are going to get larger, a bit smoother, so we've really thought about the average daily winter load profile. And as I said to you before, we're really strong now thinking about how distributed generation and storage is really going to help us manage those peaks. So that's kind of helpful from a network perspective. We can run harder if you have a smoother profile. But the biggest issue is this one here, which is the gap we have for, as I say, for dry year, and how are we going to fill, at the moment, something like coal, to a lesser extent gas, because there's a question of storage of gas. But how do you actually fill that hole when we don't have water? And the challenges around that for New Zealand, we've always said that we should not turn off our thermal generation before we actually have a cost-effective solution for dry year demand. A lot of hydro systems around the world have years of storage, a lot more capacity to buffer. We don't have that capacity, so that's a big problem for us. Just moving on quickly, we're seeing that making sure that the signals for investment for people to build, the policy settings are right, and that the innovation continues to happen and we can tap into it in New Zealand and apply it. It's going to be really, really important. So you can see that we are seeing there may even be some marine plants coming in, utility solar, geothermal, hydro, wind. We need the whole basket, all a range of renewables to come into our system. One of the benefits we have in New Zealand compared to, again, other markets is that with our big base of hydro generation and to a large extent the geothermal mix we have in there, we have a lot of inertia in our system. So we've been able to absorb quite a lot of wind, and we think we'll be able to absorb a lot more before we have power system instability issues, such as been occurring in other countries. So we have some really big benefits, which is helpful, but we have a unique dry year challenge, which I think other markets won't have. And then we think we put out 7 points for a sustainable energy future. As I said, Te Mauri Hiko was about encouraging a conversation. So we wanted people, stakeholders, government, policymakers, regulators, generators, all participants to have a conversation around what could be, what the future might be, how might we help enable this decarbonisation, how much of this was going to happen anyway, and what actually had to happen from a government, policy, regulatory perspective to actually make it happen. So we think that, we need to make sure utility investors are prepared to invest and get the right signals to invest, to build. We need to make sure the households and businesses, where it makes sense, putting in their distributed generation and storage. We need to make sure that pricing signals and policies are encouraging of renewable energy supply growth. We've really got to find a solution to the growing winter and dry year supply deficits. Networks have to evolve to handle greater demand and different complexities as they get more distributed generation in their networks in different way power flows. We are going to make sure, or we need to make sure that we have the right capacity, skills to actually deliver this really positive electricity future. It's going to be a lot more complicated, harder to manage. People are going to require different skills, and we need a collaborative, staged approach towards it. So the government in New Zealand is quite positive around this. There's a Zero Carbon Act that is in the process of passing through Parliament. They setting up, they had an interim climate change commission. There's now been a full commission being set up. It set out quite strong goals for decarbonising. We're having a debate around the merits of removing all thermal, 100% renewable power system by 2035. There's the challenges of that last 5% around this deep storage issue that we're talking through with, but there's certainly a positive policy environment towards decarbonising our economy. And now I hand over to Kate, and she can tell you about, having put Te Mauri Hiko out there, we're very conscious about continuing the conversation, talking to people about the sorts of findings and testing further, and making sure that we're always keeping it up to date and always challenging and testing our assumptions. Where do we need to refine this? How do we need to take it forward? So I'll hand over to Kate.
So after our Te Mauri Hiko paper came out, we've been continuing the conversation around emerging technologies and opportunities within New Zealand. We already had an emerging technology program underway where we were testing the capacity of our system to withstand increasing amounts of solar and batteries and wind, and we've released initial reports on those. We've done some further work around that and released a further battery report and solar report, and shortly we'll be coming out with an updated wind report as well, talking about the maximum amount of those emerging technologies that our system can withstand, which is a reasonable amount, which is good. We've also been looking at how we can get alongside the government and some of those commissions and reviews that Alison was talking about in order to help them understand the challenges within industry and the things that we may need to help ensure that we can enable the just transition to a low-carbon economy. We've been talking with the government around the challenges brought forth around our resource consenting processes and how that can add delay and constraint in terms of ensuring that there is necessary capacity and connection across the transmission system to enable new renewables to connect, and also the increase in capacity that's needed for things like electrification of industrial process heat. Beyond those conversations, we've also been doing work with inside Transpower to think, what does Te Mauri Hiko mean for us, and what is it that we need to do to ensure that we are in the best position to enable us to meet the challenges of the future, and what changes or what do we need to change within the way that we look at and plan for the future in light of what we can see going towards us and what the challenges that you all are facing globally. So we've updated our strategy to align with Te Mauri Hiko. We've got 5 strategic priorities around evolving our services to meet customers' needs, about playing that active role that I talked about in terms of what is needed to enable New Zealand's energy future. It's always important that we sustain our social licence to operate. A big thing for us at this stage and built into our planning is ensuring that we can match our infrastructure to need over time. And our challenge there is around the uncertainty of where demand and supply will arise, and where we need to ensure that we've got sufficient transmission capacity in time to enable that to be connected and flow across our system. And fifthly, to help springboard and ensure that we can actually do all that, we need to accelerate our organisational efficiency. In terms of our scenarios themselves, we've recognised that it's really important that we continue to test our scenarios and monitor the evolving environment. And so we've set up a monitoring program which you can see the drivers and the signs that we are monitoring on a quarterly basis. And this helps us to understand the degree to which we are continuing to track towards our base case, the degree to which we might need to change what our base case is for planning purposes, and which of the scenarios or scenario combinations between our demand and supply scenarios we should be looking at in terms of that envelope of plausible future scenarios or plausible possible future scenarios that we should take into account when making our investment decisions. And that's really about helping us to understand where the future is evolving and help us with our investment decision making in avoiding stranded assets and maximising our opportunities. Historically, with our modelling, we used to look primarily at GDP growth and population growth and step changes, known step changes that were coming into the system. Following Te Mauri Hiko, we've realised that that's our base forecast, but that there are a couple of extra layers that we need to put into our forecasting. So we're now forecasting EVs, electrification of process heat, residential solar and batteries is all built into the demand side scenarios. And then we have a co-optimised model that works in the cloud, where a supply side model seeks to solve to show what the generation expansion plan could be and least cost dispatch to meet that demand. We use the demand side models for things like our transmission planning report, our security of supply annual assessments, and the demand and supply scenarios to help us with our strategic studies and investigations. We're continuing to evolve our modelling, obviously as we learn more, and as Alison said, as we're getting additional information in from how our environment is evolving, then we're continually tweaking our modelling and our modelling assumptions to get them up to date. We've been looking at one of our greatest challenges as system operator is ensuring the reliability and continuing operation of our power system, especially as the generation mix changes and it becomes more intermittent. And so we've developed an operations study tool. So we can look at, as the generation mix changes, what is the impact on our operation of our power system and on the market systems. And this is leaning into our role as the system operator. And it's particularly important in terms of not only across the year but also across the day in terms of the half-hourly increments in a daily process. We're looking at things like system strength, inertia, voltage, and frequency management, which are all really important issues for us as an islanded system. And those learnings are helping us to understand the types of standards or guidelines that we'd need for people who are connecting into our system, and what tools we might need to change on our power system to ensure that we can have the necessary reserves and ensure the reliability of our system going forward. In terms of the planning of our transmission grid, we continue to do a transmission planning report, which is a sort of 15-year outlook with detailed studies about how we think that the system might change, but we're cognizant that we need to look at a longer-term view as well. So we've developed a new way to look at transmission insights across a range of scenarios using two different kind of new metrics for us. One is a peak and a load factor, load forecast factors. And essentially what we're looking at is trying to visualise where sites or assets sit in terms of investment risks and opportunities, and identify parts of the transmission system that we might need to study in more detail. We're looking for parts of the system that over a long period of time across a range of scenarios may show us that that part of the system would need greater capacity or less capacity, given where the scenarios are changing, and help us to ensure that we're not putting in place solutions under a transmission planning report in a 15-year view, that if we had thought about where it would need to change over a 30-year view, we would put different solutions in place. Cognizant always that we need to make sure that we are making prudent investments in terms of the cost that we're passing through to the New Zealand energy users. We are developing a network strategy that's almost finalised, which is encouraging people to look at the forward picture, then sort of transition engineering, come back from that in terms of determining the best solutions that we've put in place, and pulling together a visualisation tool which is increasing the information that we can consider. So not only information that we hold within Transpower, but as much information that we can gather around our external environment outside of Transpower, and putting it into a GIS tool that helps us to look at and depict information in a visual way that we are finding enables us to make bigger picture strategic decisions. And that really is about driving future-focused transition energy thinking to maximise those sort of least regrets decision-making in an uncertain future environment. For us, it's also crucial that there's security of supply, given that we are an islanded system. As Alison spoke, hydro is the base in New Zealand, but our hydro situation can change quite significantly between drought and flood situations. And the most important thing is that we ensure that there is sufficient supply to meet demand as we see demand growing. And so we've been looking at a few things here. One, how do we see under climate change the hydrological conditions might change, and does that impact favourably or otherwise the hydro base that we see being there in the future, which might exacerbate or minimise that demand gap that we foresee particularly in a dry year. And also looking at the policy settings that our regulators have in place, and whether we see that there might be a need for the regulators to think about changing those policy settings to drive greater investment in terms of supply to meet increasing demand, and particularly supply being there in time to meet the increasing demand if it takes off. And finally, we've always made scenario-based investment decisions. We're required to under a regulated investment test, but we've been broadening the mix of scenarios that we take into account, given the energy futures that we anticipate under Te Mauri Hiko. And we're also considering how we factor in those wider uncertainties arising in our energy futures to sort of maximise that less regrets decisions and minimise the risk of stranding those assets, and ensuring that we're making investments in time to enable the transition to that low carbon economy. It's not straightforward, particularly if you add in the uncertainties around commercial decision makers when we're not a vertically integrated business, when you add in the time constraints around resource consenting and significant interconnection investments that might need to be made in due course to unlock the capacity required in a higher demand future. But we're working with the regulators, government and industry to improve our understanding of that sort of bigger picture and the possible opportunities, as well as the different kind of funding options that might be open to us. And we'll continue to evolve this in future. So that's our journey and where we're getting to. We are about to kick off a next wave of work internally, just looking at those increasing challenges about enabling new connections and what that might mean, including in terms of the capacity of workforce that we might need in the future. We'll leave it there for now about the journey that we've travelled so far, and pass back to you, Lawrence, in terms of questions.
Well, thank you, Alison and Kate. Got a couple of questions here, and we'll try to squeeze in as many as we can so we can end on time, even a few minutes before. I think the first question comes back to the issue of your stakeholder process. So can you talk a little bit more about it in terms of the engagement with the government, the policymakers, and the feedback you got, specifically as it relates to your 7 points for a sustainable energy future? So just a little bit more detail about the process, and what were some of the challenges you had to overcome to reach consensus?
Thank you, Lawrence. We involved quite an extensive number of workshops with external parties as we were going through the scenarios, and that was really helpful because we got people from quite disparate points of view. So we had Greenpeace in the forum, we had the climate skeptics in the forum, we had, and it was very interesting, we managed to have some good discussions around the facts, if you like, and try to come back to common points of interest and things we could agree on, and then test where these differences of opinion lay. And I think there was a really good developed understanding about a common purpose and around the challenge. We may all disagree about how to get there and the pace, but I think there was some real common ground there. In terms of the 7 steps we've got are reasonably generic, Lawrence, so we haven't gone into government must do X, Y, Z on date B. I think it was very timely. Okay. We were just lucky in terms of when we did this, the government had already set up an interim climate commission. There's an electricity price review underway. This government has been quite active in setting up reviews, and this information was very favourably input into, for instance, the Climate Change Commission, because they were pleased that there'd been this kind of thinking to help challenge the Productivity Commission, which is an independent government agency, had also done a piece of work on decarbonising the economy, which we were able to feed into the early stages of that. So I think it was timing also that there was a consensus emerging around the opportunity, the challenge, and we've been very pleased with how it's been picked up. And as I said, it's about a topic of conversation, so you'll find just as many people who think we're wrong, but we're never planning to be right. But directionally, there's a lot of good stuff.
Yeah. No, when I read the report, and I was I was actually fortunate to read it when it came out a couple of years ago, or a year and a half ago, I think. One of the things that struck me was this issue around uncertainty, and you talk a little bit about it in your presentation. Even I think Kate went into some of the issues around it. So, can you talk about how you've been able to adapt to the uncertainty around the modeling and come up with the different scenarios? We're in 2020. Have you already begun to see some deviation from some of the assumptions you made in the process? And if so, you talk about the adaptation going forward. Have you already started to make some adaptation to your plan? How can you Can you gauge a little bit around this issue of uncertainty when you started, where you are now, and where you're going into the future? What changes you've made along the pathway?
Yeah, this is where this monitoring that Kate talked about, the quarterly monitoring, and we've got key levers, key drivers, things we're really watching, leading indicators to say, are our assumptions becoming more plausible or more unbelievable? And what does that mean in terms of our scenarios? I talked about how we saw that the uptake of domestic solar was slower than we were anticipating, and so we developed another supply scenario of roaring 40, so more wind in our mix. And we need to think about, if you have more wind, less solar and batteries behind your distribution system, that's quite a different challenge for a transmission system versus where the generation is based. So all the time we're testing these drivers, but we're careful, Lawrence, to say, let's do it on the basis of leading indicators. What are the key things that are going to move the dial? It's really important, I think, to be clear on what's a signal and what's noise. There's lots of noise out there. So being really clear about what we think are the key signals that are going to make changes in supply and demand. And I talked about at the beginning, one of the biggest challenges is we're firmly of the view that we're going to see this technology change and what's happening will be exponential growth. It's not going to be a linear progression. And the hardest thing when you're looking at exponential patterns, nothing happens, nothing happens, nothing happens, nothing happens. Holy hell, where did that come from? And the challenge you got is that you could have seen it if you had these indicators and things happening. So we're trying to pick that kind of thing. It's very hard to plan a transmission system for exponential growth and things happening. So trying to be disciplined around looking at the drivers and monitoring widely and making sure we're alert to it, talking to lots of people, getting different perspectives. And also, Kate alluded to it, the challenge we've got for an organisation like Transpower is so many positive things about the fact we've been around for 150 years. People do a sensational job at keeping the lights on for New Zealand and running a power system that's reliable, well planned, well thought through. But we're not that great at being agile, being fast, making quick decisions, building things quickly. So how do we as an organisation get ourselves fit for that future without losing any of the really good stuff that makes us a great company, but how do we also adapt? And that is something that we continue to think about, and I would be very strong in saying we don't have all the answers.
So on that point, just staying on the point of adaptation and organizational change, I know I've heard you speak many times, Alison, I've spoken to you, and you really emphasize the importance of your license to serve, or your social license, as I think you call it. So can you talk a little bit about, in terms of the transition and the change in front of you, from a workforce perspective, how are you preparing your workforce to deal with this transition? And then if you tie it to the social license, how do you deal with the sort of the conflicting sometimes objectives that you're getting from so many stakeholders as you move forward in terms of redefining what it is your social license, and how do you meet the obligations within your social license? So can you talk about those two aspects? One, the workforce transition and the preparation of the workforce, and then two, making sure that your social license is maintained, and how do you adapt to make sure that license is not compromised?
Yeah, I'll answer those a little bit differently. The first one's perhaps a little bit easier. It's a hell of a gnarly problem to solve, but we're really thinking about the resource planning, both in the short term and the long term. What kind of skills are we going to need to have in 2050, and how might we work to grow those? And in the short term, given we've, it's interesting, as I said, in the first 5 years I was in my role, no new generation requests to connect. In the last 6 months to a year, we'd have dozens. So this environment has just changed enormously. So we need to think about how do we have the right resources, and we're doing some resource planning to be able to handle that short term, and long term thinking about the skills. We outsource all of our work on the grid to a number of service providers who do all the maintenance, operations and big project build. So we have to work very, very closely with our supply chain there, the engineering consultants we use, and then the service providers working in the field to make sure that we have across that supply chain the right amount of skills. And we're conscious that the world is looking for the same kinds of people. So how do we actually make sure here in New Zealand, and that's a big piece of work the government also has on the future of work, which we're factoring into. The social license to operate is absolutely critical. It's when we do a really good job, it's quite an interesting role in Transpower. No one knows about you, under the radar. We run a power system, keep the lights on, keep things working really, really well, nothing happens. But when we have a problem, everyone knows about it, and there's lots of squealing. So with the social license to operate on all sorts of fronts. First of all, I mentioned we've got 12,000 kilometres of high voltage transmission lines which cross 30,000 properties across New Zealand. And we have, up until 1986, we were grandfathered rights of our transmission systems across New Zealand, which give us the right to go onto landowners' land and maintain our assets. Subsequent to that, we buy easements, which give us much greater property rights. We've had a real mission to try and shore up our property rights. There's all sorts of government statements on electricity transmission, etc. But we crossed 76 different councils, and in its wisdom over time, the New Zealand government decided to build social housing under our transmission lines. So in our biggest city, our transmission lines now sit in the backyards of people's properties. And that is challenging. You can imagine trying to maintain, reconductor, do work. That's difficult. So unlike a number of other jurisdictions where you've got clear corridors and very strong property rights, we're in a much weaker environment here. So, and in the past, I think people were, I'm sure it's a trend internationally, people were very proud to be part of powering New Zealand, enabling this bright future when electricity was first developed. And so people were delighted to put transmission systems and lines across their farms and their land. And nowadays there's a very different attitude. NIMBYism, I want reliable 24/7, 365 power as cheap as possible and no nasty assets anywhere near me, please. Which makes it really quite difficult. So ensuring that we are very respectful and careful about working across all the land of the properties that we get, working with the district councils to make sure they have strong planning rules around people building all sorts of things under our lines and compromising our ability. Making sure we keep the power on, because at the end of the day, people are becoming more and more dependent on power. So how do we make sure we run a good system and we don't have any major outages that black out people? We don't have a very meshed network. Like a lot of other countries, you've got lots of resilience and mesh stuff. We're long and stringy. So when we go down, it's quite impactful. So how do we make sure we manage that? Public safety, how do we make sure no one is ever hurt or, heaven forbid, killed around any of our assets? So that whole public safety piece is really important. So the whole social license is around communities, keeping on side goodwill of people, landowners, councils, property owners underneath our assets, and public safety and keeping up reliability. So the whole social license to operate, and environmentally acting, making sure that we don't do any harm to heritage sites across New Zealand or any contamination. This whole social license to operate is a key focus for us, but I think in my experience for leading all companies now, it's becoming more and more and more important. And as the world pulls more into big cities, we're becoming more urbanised, and people are becoming more demanding, and you can monitor and sense and check and know things that are happening before people do. So this whole social license, keeping communities on board, understanding that you need a role to play, is becoming a really important issue for all companies. And if you don't have it as a top priority, you're mad, because once you lose a social license to operate, it's very, very difficult to get it back.
Yeah, I know we're coming on the hour here. We try to wrap up a little bit before, but so I got 3 questions that have come in, and they're not. I'm going to just ask them all 3 or 4 of them, and then you can try to address them as quickly as you can. So the first one, Alison and Kate, is about technology. You've talked a lot about emerging technology. So which kinds of innovative technology is Transpower investing in? Artificial intelligence, augmented reality? I mean, which ones are you looking at? So that's the first question. The second question, Transpower operates the markets as well as the grid. So as part of your looking to the future, do you envision a lot of redesign of your electricity market to accommodate some of the changes with renewables, inertia issues, and what have you you've talked about? And then also, with regards to social license, what is Transpower doing, or from your perspective, in telling the story of all the positive things that Transpower is doing, not just for Transpower stakeholders in New Zealand, but just around the world? So can you talk a little bit about your storytelling exercise in terms of getting the word out about all the good things you're doing? And then the last point, if we ever get to it in your response, is about this issue of resilience. It's come up in a couple of conversations around resilience. And so as you plan for the future, I mean, we've had accidents before that have affected the security of supply. I was thinking about the airport accident a couple of years ago when the pipeline got destroyed. How have you factored in resilience in your thinking? So those 4 questions: technology, storytelling, market redesign, and resilience. If you can address those, then that should be able to wrap us up. Thanks.
Perfect. On technology, we think all these things are going to have a great role to play. Augmented artificial intelligence, machine learning, automation, augmented reality. We're doing some stuff with drones to fly lines and do inspections. We're doing augmented reality. Kate's talked about some of the fantastic sort of tools we've got on. We think automation is going to play a key role around our control systems. Machine learning, we're doing some stuff on. We've got data for coming out of our ears, but actually pulling it out, learning and getting insights, like all our trips and daily alarms and things. How can we use that? We're using a lot of, in the field, forced mobility to actually use tools to pull data back straight away into our system. So we're looking at a lot of new technologies. We're not bleeding edge. And we're also trying different innovation techniques, such as using agile and stringing up sprints and teams to address really big, gnarly problems. Like we're coming up with aging conductor issues, big spending in tower corrosion, painting towers, and reconductoring. How might we apply new innovative techniques to actually rethink how we solve those problems? In terms of do we need to redesign the energy market, I think that inevitably there'll need to be some changes. Where we are incredibly lucky is we can absorb a lot of intermittent power into our system, solar and wind, because of the big inertia we've got from the hydro and geothermal plant. So we are probably got a bit of luxury of time to watch what's happening in other markets and how we might need to adapt. So certainly on our horizon, and also just thinking around this nexus of system operations versus distribution system operations. When you start to get a lot of distributed generation and load and different things happening in dynamic networks, how might that pan out, and how are we going to have that working? And you talked about resilience. Well, at the end of the day, we're always thinking about that balance about having a reliable, resilient power system, able to handle those big sort of overbuilt, that you end up with an extraordinary expensive system. So it's always a real challenge around making sure. At the end of the day, too, we have a power system that lives across a very active earthquake-prone country. We've got a big Cook-Strait cable. We believe we've got the resilience in it we need to, but there's always a conversation and a challenge. You'll all know, unfortunately, there's trade-offs. So how hard you build your system versus cost is always a good to debate, and that's where the regulatory and investment tests are always there. And then you asked about how do we tell a story. I think badly. We're not we're quite mindful of being careful about sticking our head above the parapet. We are a monopoly, a regulated monopoly. We're kind of easy game for industry participants to have our cost impact there. So we try to have a constructive dialogue about this, but I don't think that's something we do that well. We're certainly not marketers. And I think I'll...
Okay, well...
Lawrence?
Yeah, no, I think that covers quite a ground. We've gotten a few other questions we'll send to you all if you want to flag it and maybe respond to the questioners at some point in time. But I really appreciate this. It's been a very good conversation. I think we've got some insights. Like I said, what New Zealand is doing is certainly things that the rest of the world can learn from and vice versa. So we certainly look forward to continuing this dialogue around the planning of the future. And with that, I will turn it over to Jess, who can wrap things up. Jess?
Sure. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And Alison and Kate, thank you very much for your presentation. We will be circulating the slides within about a week of today. And as I mentioned earlier, we will also have the recording available on our YouTube channel. So with that, that's a wrap. So thank you, everyone. And we'll be in touch soon.